Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. We are back here with week 3 of the ABCs of Canadian Whiskey. We are joined with Dave, Gina, and Ricky, as always. This week is all about maturation and flavor. So stick around with us for the next hour. We're going to deep dive into that, along with a little tasting for our students. So students, make sure you have your tasting kits. Like always, we're joined by Ricky. So if you are more comfortable engaging in Spanish, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, comment and we will get that translated for you through Ricky and sent back. So make sure you're engaging in the comments when the tasting comes. We love to hear your tasting notes, but that'll be later in the video. So I am going to pass it over to Gina and Dave.
All right. Okay. Hello, everybody. We're in week 3 of the ABCs certification. We are diving into maturation this week, as you can see, and we're going to dive right in. So, the warehouses. Like the other classes, especially last week, we really started seeing a lot of footage from the Hiram Walker & Sons distillery, just to give you scope of what we're talking about here. And these are the Pike Creek warehouses at the Hiram Walker & Sons distillery. So there's 16 of them, housing over 1.6 million barrels every day. We're going to see what's happening in those barrels and how that influences our whiskey today. Those barrels are stacked 6 high, 600 per row, and there is no temperature control. So you see all of that rust on those rings around the barrels? Looks kind of funky, yeah? That rust isn't getting into our whiskey, of course, but it is showing us what's happening in those warehouses with lots of condensation, forming a lot of rust around the rings of those barrels. And we're going to explore what is happening without having temperature control in those warehouses in Windsor, Ontario, what's happening inside the barrel as well. Okay, so let's touch back on those regulations. We went through that week 1, but regulations as it pertains to maturation of whiskey says it shall be aged in small wood. What does that mean? For not less than 3 years. Okay, 3 years, pretty standard. Small wood. Here's some illustrations of barrels. That means 700-liter barrels or less. Now, typically in Canada, you're really not going to see over 300-liter barrels because they cannot legally transport a larger size on the highway. The Pike Creek warehouses are about a 20-minute drive from the main distillery campus that we saw last week in a photo. So most of the barrels being aged or aging whiskey at Pike Creek are around that 200 to 250 liter in size, okay? But not less than 3 years. So all Canadian whiskey, no matter what style, is aged at least 3 years before it can be called Canadian whiskey. Now, they can use any type of wood to age their whiskeys. So here's some examples at Pike Creek. And this is not an exhaustive list, okay? Just some of them. Mostly they're using new white American oak, once-used bourbon casks, or multiple use Canadian casks. And what they're referring to there is barrels that get used over and over and over and over until they fall apart. Okay, so not a lot of wood influence on those multiple use barrels. That's more for what we're going to talk about later, the terroir, the environment, how that's affecting the whiskey. Okay, also rum barrels. There's Hungarian oak, red oak, tequila barrels, sherry barrels, red wine barrels. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They can also put inserts into those barrels to affect the flavor. Different types of wood, whether there's previous contents in them or not, all affect the flavor and all change the flavor profile of that final whiskey. Okay. Dilution. So going into the barrel, the whiskey is actually going to get diluted. So through distillation, remember it came up. That single column still, the ABV was at about 70%. Double column distillation came up to just under vodka, 94, 95%. And then that single column into a pot still, that slow pot distillation at Hiram Walker, that's bringing it from the 70% up to 80% ABV. Going into the barrel then, they are going to add some water, and that's it. They're going to come down to 58% for the single column distillation or single column and pot, and down to 76% for the double column distillation whiskeys. Okay, so now this room is the drain and fill room. These barrels are coming directly off the truck. So the truck backed up to the door that you're going to see when these barrels pull away. You see that the barrels in the background, those are on the truck. They come right on this conveyor belt. They go down this line. This is moving at about 100 times in speed, faster than the line actually moves. They're going to move through there. A mechanism is going to pull off the bung that's on the top. There's going to be a hose that goes in, vacuums out or sucks out the whiskey, drains the barrel. It keeps moving down the line. The barrel gets refilled with a separate hose, new whiskey. It keeps moving down the line onto a new truck that's at the end of the line and back out to the warehouse. And that's why at Hiram Walker and Sons, they can have consistently about 1.6 million barrels, because if they're taking 1,300 off that day and draining them, it's going right down that line and they're getting filled immediately and back to the warehouse. Okay. Barrel influence. So how is the wood affecting the whiskey and the flavor of the whiskey? So first, let's look at charring. Charring is putting this, massive flame through the center of the barrel. There's a few different ways to do it, but here's a photo of one of them. And it does a few things for the whiskey. So when you burn that wood on the inside, it's leaving a layer of char. That layer of char is a carbon filter, much like a Brita filter. So as the whiskey moves in and out of the wood, as the wood kind of expands and contracts, depending on the temperature and the humidity, right? And the whiskey's moving in and out, it's getting filtered through that layer of char. And it's removing any sulfur compounds, hopefully, any that's left. Now, last week we talked about sulfur quite a bit, actually. And so did Amy in our expert session on Thursday. But we talked about, at Hiram Walker and Sons, they have 100% copper stills. They have copper pads at the top. I mean, they're putting copper everywhere they can put copper in the distillation to remove as much sulfur as possible. But not everyone has a ton of copper in their distillation system. And that's by choice for one reason or another. But you can have stainless steel. There's all kinds of materials. Most popular stainless steel and copper for your stills. But the more copper you have, the more sulfur will be removed in distillation, the less char you might want in maturation in your barrels, because you don't need to remove that sulfur if that's the purpose for the char. So less char needed for sulfur removal. If you have a distillation with very little copper in your stills, you might need a heavier char through time to really soften, get rid of those sulfur compounds through maturation. Because like we said last week, we don't want to drink those sulfur notes, right? Now the char can also add to our whiskey. So it will add wood extracts. And that's because in the burning of the wood, when we're charring it, it's caramelizing the wood sugars. And so It's going to degrade the cellulose, the hemicellulose, and the lignin, which makes up the plant fiber of the wood, all plant fibers, okay, the wood. And it's going to develop oak lactones. And again, as that whiskey moves in and out, it's going to pick up those notes. It's going to add some wood extract. And that can also be color, which we'll talk about in a minute. So here's a chart from Dr. Don Livermore, the master blender at Hiram Walker, his PhD. He studied barrel influence, particularly depth of char, and how that is influencing wood extract into the whiskey. Now, going into this, I think he thought the deeper the char, the more wood extract you'll get. That kind of makes sense to me. However, that's not really what happened. Over time, you can see that red line at the top. That is a 2 millimeter depth of char, a number 2 char barrel. You can see it. You get more wood extract from a number 2 char barrel than a number 4 char barrel. So if you want more wood extract in, you don't necessarily have to have the highest char. You might want a higher char, a number 4 char level, for other reasons, to remove sulfur possibly. For all of these, and of course, you look at the blue and the purple line there, those are used barrels. One had bourbon in it previously and was only used once. Drastically less wood influence in there. You're going to get some bourbon influence, but drastically less wood influence than a new barrel. And then the multiple use barrel, you're going to get a little, but not a ton. Now, for all of these, though, if you look at the first 200 days, so the days are at the bottom of the chart. If you look at the 200 days in the beginning of maturation, this is where you see the most wood extract going in, right? That line is the steepest, and that's really where you're going to get the most wood extract from your barrel is in those first 200 days. Okay, so let's break down cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. The analogy we like to use here is a brick wall. So your cellulose are very big dextrose units, chains of sugar, dextrose units. 40 to 50% of the plant fiber is going to be made up of cellulose. This is like the bricks in a brick wall. Your hemicellulose is more like the smaller loose bricks. They're much smaller, only like 200 units long. And they don't take up nearly as much of the plant fiber. And then your lignin is kind of like the mortar. It's what's really holding it all together. 10 to 20%. Lots of flavor in that lignin though. And when you break these down, when you char the barrel, when you break them down, you're going to now break them open and see all these wonderful flavors coming to life. Caramel, vanilla, leather, sweet smoke, tobacco notes, all kinds of wonderful wood extract that can come into your whiskey. A few other ways a barrel influences our whiskey. Tannins. So this is odorless. When you're nosing a whiskey, you cannot smell tannin. It is bitter. It adds a bitterness to the whiskey. It is kind of tea-like. I always feel tannins on my gums. They sort of dry out my gums. A little bit of stringency there, but then it's really drying on my gums. Some people feel it on the sides of their tongue. But you're going to get kind of a chalky, astringent, dry mouthfeel from tannins. Oak lactones, those develop during charring. Those give us coconut notes, okay? And it depends if they're, the ratio of translactones, okay? So here you can see French oak is going to give you more vanilla because it's a 1-to-1 ratio, whereas American oak actually has more on the ratio, more oak lactones than translactones. You're going to get a little bit more coconut notes on those from those barrels. And then, of course, the barrel is going to influence our whiskey in adding color. How much color? This is dependent on a lot of different things. Length of time in the wood, type of wood being used. We just saw French and American oak being compared for lactones, same for color. How new is the barrel? Is it the first time it's being used? Has it been used twice? You're going to get different amounts of color coming in from the barrel there. Okay, so diffusion. Through time, when you have a barrel that had something else previously in it, this is often referred to as barrel finishing. Finished in blah, blah, blah barrels, port barrels, rum barrels, sherry barrels, you pick it. But the scientific term is diffusion. And what's happening here when you're barrel finishing is, okay, under the little magnifying glass there, we have all these little green dots. Okay, they're in the wood. These are the molecules that are making up the previous contents. Let's say this barrel had rum in it previously. Okay, so all those little green dots are rum. Through time, you put the whiskey in there. Okay, the rum's emptied out, but it's in the there's some in the wood. That's those green dots. We put the whiskey in the barrel. Through time, those molecules are going to come to equilibrium between the whiskey and the wood. They're not all going to come into the whiskey. They're going to distribute themselves evenly on where they can live between the whiskey and the wood. Now, different types of barrels, whatever contents were in them previously, are going to give you different flavor notes into your whiskey. So, for instance, sherry, depending on what kind of sherry, but you could get some walnuts, raisin, dates, prunes. Port gives a little like dark fruit, spicy note, even a little bit of chocolate in there. Rum, like we just talked about, island spices, even some like brown sugar notes. Bourbon barrels, which are used often at the Hiram Walker Distillery, that's going to give us some dried fruit notes, that caramel, that vanilla that we know bourbon to be so well known for, right? Okay, back to our chart from Dr. Don. In talking about, this chart was really made for wood extract, but now these rum molecules are living in the wood and the whiskey's coming in and out of the wood through time. Same thing. Diffusion is really happening. It comes to equilibrium in about those first 200 days. So after 200 days, give or take a little, you're really not getting more rum, let's say, into the whiskey. So, saying something like, this whiskey was finished for 7 years in rum cask and it has more rum. No, it has the same amount of rum that it had at 200 days in the whiskey. What has happened, though, and why the flavors have developed more from the rum, is that through angel share and evaporation of the alcohol, the rum in the whiskey has concentrated, because that's not evaporating. And those flavor compounds are becoming more concentrated because the liquid itself, some of it is evaporating away over time. So you might get a stronger flavor note from those finishing barrels, but you're not actually getting more of it into the barrel. Okay, finally, terroir. So I touched on this at the beginning. And, this is something I've seen writers, blenders really debate this topic, which is fun, I think. But, at Hiram Walker and Sons, they really can show how terroir affects the whiskey through maturation. So in Windsor, Ontario, where the Pike Creek warehouses are, there are drastic temperature fluctuations, right? There are summers, it's right on the Great Lakes, super humid, hot summers, kind of like Kentucky, really, at the end of the day, but very humid around the Great Lakes. And then winters, I mean, we're up north. We're in Canada. One year it was -40. It is cold in the wintertime. You get that Great Lakes, winter effect as well. So drastic temperature fluctuations. And what that means is that there's more ethyl acetate development through time into the liquid that's in the barrel. That's because oxygen, those barrels are expanding and contracting more. And oxygen then eventually through a series of chemical reaction reacts with the alcohol. There's about, 10 chemical reactions. It's a chain reaction that happens instantly from oxygen reacting with the alcohol. And what's developed at the end of the day is ethyl acetate. Okay, what does that mean? This is a chart of double column distilled corn whiskey at Hiram Walker. So very light in style, that double column distillation. It is being aged in multiple used Canadian whiskey barrels. So they've been used over and over and over. We're not getting a lot of wood influence. And through time, you can really show that line going up. This is the ethyl acetate development. And what flavor it's developing in the whiskey is a very bright green apple note. So you can really, when you taste, a Canadian whiskey, all whiskeys do this though. They develop ethyl acetate over time through maturation. The barrels breathe. Oxygen is going to react. The terroir, how much the barrels are going to breathe, how much the whiskey is going to interact with the oxygen, is going to affect how much ethyl acetate is developed. So there is a very bright green apple note that is noticeable, especially in something like this, a very super light whiskey. If we look at bourbon, it's very grain forward, right? The grain, the yeast forward flavors, big, bold flavors there that sometimes can cover up the green apple ethyl acetate development. If we look at something like Scotch, that is a more temperate climate in Scotland. So less ethyl acetate development. It's still there. It could also be covered up by peat that some Scotches are known for. Those peat, smoky notes. So it can get covered up because it is bright and light, but it is there. And depending on your terroir, depending on your climate and your environment, will depend on how much ethyl acetate is developed through time. Okay, so I am going to hand it over to Dave to take us through 2 delicious whiskeys for maturation.
Thank you, Gina. Wait, do we have any questions that need to be answered? I feel like the ones that have been answered. One person, bung is on the top of the barrel, question mark?
Yes, at Hiram Walker, they are using barrels that the bung is, when the barrel is upright, it is on the top. It is in the head of the barrel. There are some whiskey styles that put the bung in the side, but that is not what they do at Hiram Walker. They're palletizing those barrels. So to prevent leakage, they're putting the bung at the top.
And yes, to the second question would be, when we're getting next bourbon cask, we're filling the bung on the side and then drilling.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Are the barrels recharred before being refilled?
They can be. Sometimes there are some rechar barrels. I know Lot 40 is aging in some rechar, and there's a few other things going on at Hiram Walker, but not all of Lot 40. There's some Lot 40 experiments, is what I should have said. That was confusing. But typically, if they're going to put it like, let's say, an ex-bourbon barrel and try to get those those flavor compounds, typically they're not recharring it. They're just leaving as is and maturing that way.
And last but not least, Nora asks, is there a set formula for added dilution prior to maturation, or does it change for every batch?
It does not change for every batch. It is a set formula. I think every distillery kind of has their own formula of what that is. I know we've asked Don before, and students have in previous sessions asked Don, like, how did you get to, 76%, 58%? Why are you diluting it to those exact ABVs? Those were actually set before he was in his position, before he even worked for the distillery. So we can ask him tomorrow, because he is our guest, if he has any insight on how those got set. But they were set before his time. I do know that.
And I was going to say, too, I certainly don't want to ignore anyone. More questions are coming in. Now, I'm looking at the questions. Keep them in mind, guys. I already know Don's going to answer these tomorrow during his talk. But just there's no point of us answering when Don's going to go over tomorrow. But keep them in mind in case he doesn't answer your specific question. I think would be safe to say.
Good idea.
Yeah. And Nora does have very good questions. I agree. All right, so we're going to taste some whiskey. I just want to say I apologize for missing you last week. Had a little family urgency that I had to look after. I think we all know family comes first. I saw you last. I was in Whistler, British Columbia, and now I'm at the other side of the country in New Brunswick. I think most Canadians would know where that is. You better know where that is. In the Maritimes, on the water, for our American friends. I'm right next to Maine and Vermont. I'm about a 5-hour drive to Portland, Maine right now. A lot of fishing villages. Very cold where I am. I went for a walk this morning and it was minus 23 Celsius, which makes that about -9 Fahrenheit. Oh, it's a little chilly here. So let's get into some whiskey. What are we going to try first, Gina? JP Weiser's 18?
Yeah, let's do it.
Good. I am in a loft above my parents' garage right now, so luckily my father had some whiskey kicking around that I could find. Now, it's not a real fancy whiskey glass. We're looking at little garage shot glasses. So the 18-year-old, it's a beautiful deep autumn amber. Looking at it, 40 ABV, 80 proof is what we'll be trying. It's 100% corn whiskey blended. This is one of the softest, leanest, lightest whiskeys we have in our portfolio. Nosing it, I kind of get a little bit of fresh pine off that. Certainly mature oak, like the autumn florals Dr. Don always says, which is in my mind now. Sipping it, like you say, that's lean, that's soft, that's smooth, that's so easy to sip on. I get off this. Gina talks about the ethyl acetate. Maybe it's my head now, but I do get that. I get the Granny Smith dipped in caramel. I get the mature oak. I get the spices from the ex-bourbon casks, which are now Canadian whiskey casks. Very easy to sip on. I've had bartenders make me a cocktail with this, but lighter style and price point, it wouldn't make as much sense for you to use as a regular cocktail ingredient. We enjoy this one on its own. Cube of ice, whatever you like. Bright, and they get the piney brown sugar. I see that. See, I like this, everyone jumping in. Toffee apples, exactly. It's that green Granny Smith dipped in caramel apples, which I love.
If you look at your tasting booklet and look at your polar histogram there, of course, make some notes on your tasting and production style. But if you look at your polar histogram, now that we're in week 3, you can start to really understand how to read these polar histograms, knowing that this is double column distilled, that goes all the way around on the right-hand side, all Canadian whiskey barrels. that line that's vertical. And then age is really coming out here on the bar graph. It's 18 years old. That makes sense.
Oh, I like the and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, chassis, the nutmeg. I like that. I've never heard that before, and I get that right away when you say it. It's good. It's really good. What do you think, Ricky? Well, he's on mute. He's speechless. He likes it so much.
We do have a question. I think this is a good whiskey to answer this question about, Dave. How many times does a barrel get reused before it is sold or discarded?
Okay, so none of you have had the time. You spent time with Amy last year, and Amy's the coolest. She's a badass. And knows her stuff. You're going to meet Dr. Don tomorrow, our master blender, who wrote his dissertation when he was getting his PhD on what wood does to spirits. He's going to get in deep. My favorite thing about Don is he doesn't romanticize anything. He tells you how it is. Gina and Ricky can back me up on this. He'll tell you, I'm using his words, they'll use the barrel until it falls apart. And you saw the graph, his graph Gina showed you of what we get from that. And they literally will use the barrel till it falls apart. Now, keep in mind, if it's an ex-bourbon cask that we use to over and over as a Canadian whiskey cask, if it's the 18-year-old whiskey, that cask would be used. I mean, if it was used 4 or 5 times, you're looking at 100 years, which is pretty wild. So how many times does a barrel get used? So it's discarded. I mean, Dawn will go into it tomorrow, but if you were in one of our warehouses, we're surrounded. You saw the videos Gina showed. Stacked high, 600 per row. It is incredible. Like, you can't even walk from one end of the warehouse to the other if the doors haven't been open all day, because you would pass out from the fumes. You literally couldn't make it across. You would pass out, which is nuts. There's a lot of whiskey in there. You'll see there'll be a pallet of barrels that have fallen apart, and they have to keep them because we get audited twice a year. So if a barrel falls off and breaks, hopefully that doesn't happen, but it does sometimes. If a barrel just collapses, they have to keep those to prove to the tax people that we've not just lost a barrel.
Yeah. All right. Let's go on to Pike Creek diffusion.
Right. I've already poured it. So, okay. Pike Creek. Pike Creek, if you paid enough attention, Gina was telling you that's the area where those 16 warehouses are. Pike Creek is our whiskey. It's a story of maturation. It starts off exactly like a traditional Canadian whiskey. The majority of it is a double column distilled corn whiskey, a little bit of rye blended in, both aged for 10 years in ex-bourbon casks. So with that light corn, it's a little spiciness of the rye ex-bourbon cask, dried fruit notes, aged in ex-rum casks. Now, at Hiram Walker, we make a lot of other spirits besides whiskey. We make vodkas, gins, rums. We make other whiskeys for different companies. We make liqueurs, you name it. It's a big factory. One of the rums we make is called Lamb's Rum. Actually, where I am right now in the Maritimes, it is huge, and it's big in the UK as well, known across Canada. It is not sold in the US, so if any Americans have seen it on shelves, it would be here in Canada or the UK. Once we've made that rum, we have these leftover casks up from the Caribbean. So we'll take that 10-year-old corn and rye whiskey and we'll age it. As Gina said, it's never in there more than 200 days, production purposes. Looking at this, you've got this beautiful kind of polished copper to it. 42 ABV, so 84 proof. I mean, right away you get, I'm sure the tasty notes, I think it says something about golden raisins, brown sugar, obviously, A lot of people will say maple because they think Canada, but it's almost like a molasses to me. First sip. It's subtle. There's a majority of that light, lean corn whiskey, little spice of rye, the baking spices. I mean, you get some English toffee. I get the island spices, almost like Christmas or holiday cake. Or what are those? Somebody give me the answer to this. What are those chocolate orange Christmas holiday things we get where you break them and they fall apart? It's a chocolate orange. That's what I always get off this. I like the pineapple upside down cake. Oh yeah, Gina, can they look at the bottle of Pike Creek?
Oh, sure. It's actually better. There's a better picture in your tasting booklet, but because I don't have enough whiskey in this bottle anymore. But this is the rum finish. Same one that's in your tasting booklet.
Can tell Gina likes that whiskey. And this one, I mean, you're all tasting it. It is dangerously easy to sip. Like, it's very light, but it's probably the sweetest whiskey we have in our portfolio. So, just on its own is great. Terry's Orange. That's Terry's Orange. Thank you, Tim. That's exactly what I was thinking of. Now, I like when things happen naturally. As Gina and I, being from the bar industry, we didn't want brands telling us what to do. And I know you don't want brands telling you what to do. So we try not to do that. But what's happened enough around the world where Pike Creek is sold that we've actually adapted our drink strategy to what bartenders have been doing, because it's so similar, is these months, like, right now when it's cold out where I am, we're seeing coffee style cocktails. We're seeing flips. We're seeing a lot of dessert cocktails with this rum influenced whiskey, which makes perfect sense to me. But as soon as, the spring comes, summer, maybe you're down in Texas, California, we're seeing bartenders use this whiskey with that rum influence, and they're muddling up herbs and fresh juices and crushed ice and kind of doing tropical style drinks with this, which is great. Yeah, fruit cake.
My favorite pina colada, frozen pina colada.
The
pina
colada. The pina colada.
Canada.
And I got to give credit to the woman who created that, Carly Gaskin out of Tennessee. She also made a really great old fashioned with this, but she used a saline syrup, like, to make it saltier. And bless her, she called it the Saline Dion.
Oh, the puns. If you look in your tasting booklet at Pike Creek and look at your polar histogram here, again, drastically different from the 18-year-old. Very different, visual to even look at. But you can see that green bar coming very prominently out all the way to the end on finishing barrels. That's because this rum finishing barrel, that diffusion, had a lot of influence on the flavor of this whiskey. Because before the rum gets in there, it's a lot like 18-year-old. It's predominantly corn. It's got a little bit of rye in there, but it's predominantly that double column distilled corn. So interesting. I always think these polar histograms are very interesting to see the flavor components that are actually measured.
Absolutely. Any other, I was going to say, there's some good, we got to keep track of these. There's some great tasty notes already here. And highball, I agree, makes a really nice highball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, just to finish up about tomorrow. So for our 100 students that are with us, you are in for a treat tomorrow with Dr. Don Livermore. He's going to go very deep on maturation. So make sure you've got your notebooks and pens ready to go, because he's going to go deep, but he's also going to answer a lot of your questions that overnight you might be thinking about, might come to mind. We'll make sure that those get answered tomorrow.
Yeah. And you get them the week after as well. So if there's something that's not covered, you'll be good. 4 whole hours with them.
Woo!
It's a lot, but it's awesome.
Yes. Awesome. They are loving that Pike Creek, so don't drink all of it. We have 1 more week. Save some.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, if there are no more questions, then we'll give you all a little bit of time back. So thank you all for joining us today. Like and subscribe from wherever you're watching so you can keep up with more education like this. Next week is our final week of this program, week 4. So we'll be joined by Dave, Gina, and Ricky again one last time. So meet us back here, 3 p.m. Eastern next Wednesday. Come with your questions. Students, come with your tasting kits, our last tasting of the program. And then students will see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern with Dr. Dawn. So until then, enjoy. Happy drinking.
Thanks, gang.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Tomorrow.
Bye.